You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Live from New York, the Ed Sullivan Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today we get to meet the Beatles! And now, here's Julian, Arthur, and Steve.
Hey, everybody. How's everybody today?
We're good.
Ready to roll, Steve.
I want to hold your hand, Steve.
And go away in a yellow submarine.
You know, last night was a hard day's night. It's funny. There are young people out there who don't know who the Beatles are, which I find amazing because in 1964, when they really became over the top, there wasn't a person on this planet who didn't know who the Beatles are. And I was not one of them. I mean, I knew about them only from third or fourth hand, but I was not a music person at all. In fact, I didn't start listening to music till 1969 when I bought my first car. But you guys probably were caught up in it immediately, especially in the movie business, Arthur, right?
Well, yes, but at the same time, let's do a little backstory on the Beatles, just a backstory. One of the things that the younger people really don't realize, even because I'm going to believe that most of them do know who the Beatles are or have heard of them. I think their music is still popular. A little backstory. The Beatles came along globally, actually. It started in late 1963, exploded in the United States in early 1964. So
Ed Sullivan.
He brought him over and bang, it went completely crazy. But for people to fully understand the impact of the Beatles, understand that in late 1963, November 22 to be exact, our President JFK, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. Only several months later did the Beatles come on the scene. So the truth of the matter is that the so-called Age of Innocence in the United States, which was basically the 1950s, really ended in the 1963 with the assassination of JFK. It was unthinkable, unbelievable. It didn't make sense. It was just horrible. It was a horrible thing. And just a couple of months later, along come the Beatles, and the revolution begins in this country in terms of the cultural revolution. Sex, drugs, rock and roll from the Age of Innocence evolved into this area where the Beatles came on scene with their haircuts and the sound and the music and all that. They were the biggest thing that ever happened in music. I will only say from a personal note, I was still in the music business when they got on the scene. And I remember being in the Brill building and going up elevators and stuff to offices and hearing people talking about the Beatles, they'll last maybe a year. They'll be here it'll be over. Then I went to work for United Artists in the movies, and I heard that this picture, Hard Day's Night, got to make it fast because they're going to be gone by Christmas. So they got to get it out fast. No one believed.
It's true.
I will end by saying I heard the same kind of things in 1956, 57 in places like elevators in the Brill building and 1615 Broadway about a guy named Elvis Presley. He'll be a truck driver in a year and a half. People just don't know, do they? But the Beatles revolutionized music and in many ways our country.
Well, it's true, and you're right to kind of label 64 as the year they really become international. In the early 60s, they were very well known in England. They were very big in there. They started as a group called the Quarrymen, and then they changed their name to the Silver Beatles with a B-E-E, and then they became what we know, the Beatles. But not, as Arthur said, 63 when Kennedy is assassinated, February 64 on the Ed Sullivan Show, and out comes I Want to Hold Your Hand, that explodes like no song, becomes a number one song. And then on top of that, that summer, United Artists releases A Hard Day's Night. So 1964, they explode, and that's their real international beginning. Steve, when did you kind of know about them?
Well, as you guys know, I am a big James Bond guy. I embraced, 64 was a big time for James Bond as well, because Christmas time that year, they bring out Goldfinger, which was such a huge, enormous hit 60 years ago. Friends in school were really into the Beatles. It came to me via osmosis. I had to go see A Hard Day's Night because everybody was going to see A Hard Day's Night. And the sight of these guys, who were kind of alien-like, because I'd never seen haircuts like that before, they were actually a lot of fun. And that movie, I came into that movie completely clueless as to what these guys were. And the movie is a hoot. You know how much that movie cost? $500,000. That pays for hamburgers on the set of a major movie these days.
Is that Richard Lester?
Richard Lester. And it's kind of, A Hard Day's Night is a day in the life of the Beatles. And it's kind of what we call today a little bit of a mockumentary, I would say, because it's poking fun. Wouldn't you agree?
Here's the thing. Here's the X factor, the wild card about the Beatles. This is it. They were great. I mean, these guys were fantastic, not only in their ability to sing and perform, but as songwriters. These guys were the Irving Berlins and the Rodgers and Hammersteins of that period. Their songs have lasted the test of time. They come with a couple of novelty songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand, and She Needs You, Yay, Yay, Yay. And they wrote Yesterday comes on the scene with strings that they took away from. They loved Buddy Holly. When Buddy Holly was doing strings in the late 50s, he found something. Rock and roll usually did not use strings. The Beatles adopted that. But the great X factor about the Beatles is they were great. They weren't just freaks; they were great.
That's absolutely true. They were sensational. But you mentioned the strings. You mentioned Yesterday. We have to talk about George Martin. George Martin was the man who was a classically trained musician, a pianist, and he took that kind of bubblegum music that was really popular and said to them what you just said, Arthur. Let's add strings here. Let's get a chorus here. Let's do much more. You can go further. And he is the one, I think, even Lennon and McCartney at times admitted that he was the fifth Beatle, that he really made the change for them. And that was important.
He was the producer.
He was their producer. See, it's interesting that George Martin is the producer of Goldfinger's Shirley Bassey. George Martin is the producer of Live and Let Die. That was the big song that McCartney did. He produced that as well, not just the Beatles songs. I mentioned George Martin, and I'll stop after a while, but to just I guess in a way, history doesn't remember sometimes the most important people. And Beatles, great, no question, but he put them in a totally different level when they worked with him.
Well, he did. There's no question about it. I have two really favorite Beatles songs. I'm going to be curious to know what everybody's favorites are, including Mike, Steve, Julian, of course. My two favorite Beatles songs are The Long and Winding Road, which was produced by Phil Spector, who really was a genius, dark as he was.
Yep.
And the other one was Blackbirds, both written by the Beatles. But those are my favorite recordings of them amongst many. What about you guys?
Well, one of the first singles I ever purchased when I suddenly started to realize that I should have some Beatles songs, I bought the album, the Abbey Road album, which is a classic Abbey Road classic album. And my first single I bought was Penny Lane, which was, I believe, on... I'm not sure what album. Mike, what album was Penny Lane on? Do you remember?
Penny Lane, I think, was on Sergeant
Yes,
Pepper.
I think you're right. The thing that I think as a non-music person in '64 that really impressed me was starting to see video of screaming girls. I mean, I'd never seen young women, shrieking as much as when the Beatles were performing. They came out to Los Angeles. They performed at Dodger Stadium. The story goes, at most of their concerts, no one could hear their music because the girls were screaming so much. In fact, I think that's part of the reason the Beatles stopped doing live performances. Nobody was really, and the girls, they weren't listening to the music. They were just screaming.
Well, one of the real reason I think, though, Steve, most importantly, they were really exhausted. They were exhausted. They were physically drained from all the touring, and they decided they don't want to tour anymore. It's enough. But back to the questions that Arthur asked about the songs, one of my favorite songs, but nothing compared to what Sinatra said, was written by George Harrison, not by Lennon and McCartney, which is something. Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other. And Sinatra said at his concerts, this is the greatest love song written in the last 50 years. So I'll jump on Frank's bandwagon and say that's one of mine too. I love Yesterday that McCartney did, and Hey Jude,
great song,
was supposed to be Hey. He was writing it to Julian Lennon. McCartney was, because Julian was going to be losing his parents. They were going to be breaking up. John Lennon was divorcing, and Jude was. He couldn't do Julian in the rhyme of it because it was 2 syllables. So he went from Hey Julian to Hey Jules, and then Hey Jules didn't work again. And then he got Hey Jude. So it's a great song. And of course, since it started out with my first name, I have a feeling about it as well.
Now, there's a song that George Harrison also wrote, which I would say is one of the greatest songs I've ever heard. And that is While My Guitar Gently Sleeps. Are you all familiar with that?
Oh, yes.
One of my favorites, actually.
Yeah.
What a song.
Arthur, is it Sleeps or Weeps?
Oh, Weeps. I think you're right.
Yep. It's Why My Guitar.
Haunting.
It's actually not George Harrison playing the guitar. It's actually Eric Clapton playing the guitar.
But also, Here Comes the Sun, George Harrison wrote. That's S-U-N, as we know.
And the thing about the Beatles is that, everybody believes, well, John Lennon wrote these things. Paul McCartney certainly wrote these things. But people take for granted that George Harrison was writing some of the songs. And so, in fact, did Ringo write a song or two.
That's right.
It was unbelievable.
They had distinct personalities. I have to say that visually, there's never been a group like the Beatles with all 4 faces. I mean, there have been very handsome groups, but I don't know if you could compare anybody to the physical effect these young men had on America and the world, of course. I mean, Paul McCartney in his prime was a hunk of man.
Well, he was the one the girls loved the most. He was the one that got.
He was the cute one.
Wow. The screaming thing you bring up, it was not originally them. That was happening to Frank Sinatra in the early 40s at the Paramount Theater. He was getting screamed.
You're talking about
something about the girls screaming. Yeah. It was girls, Bobby Soxers in those days. And then it happened again to Eddie Fisher in the early 50s. And then it happened without question with Elvis Presley. Yeah. And then even after the Beatles, it happened to a guy who I became very friendly with named David Cassidy. David told me he used to leave NBC, he used to leave the taping on a Friday, and they'd fly to Hawaii. He'd do a concert to 100,000 kids in one of the stadiums, and he couldn't hear himself sing. It was just screaming. So what is it about the screaming? Let's talk about screaming girls. What makes that happen?
Yeah, there's been stories out there with the Beatles and interviews like with Ringo or Paul or George. Then they were talking about like the concert at Shea Stadium that, they couldn't even hear each other play. They were just, they were shocked it came out so good. That's how loud it was.
It also proved how great a drummer Ringo Starr was, because he was not getting great publicity. He was not supposed to be that good. But the truth was that he was able to keep the beat going on with 55,000 people screaming at Shea Stadium. He couldn't hear, but he knew how to keep the beat going with them.
Julian, there was a 78-year-old man sitting up in the right field bleachers who was not screaming.
Yes, but he never made it out. He passed out. They never saw him again. Sid Bernstein.
I think I told this story.
Guys,
before.
let me make a quick correction real quick before people write us. Penny Lane actually was on Magical Mystery Tour, not on Sgt. Pepper. And also it was recorded in the same sessions as Sgt. Pepper, but not it was the flip side of Strawberry Fields.
I mean, the thing about the Beatles in terms of their songwriting and their melody and their just their whole type of music, here it is 60 years later, and you could listen to those songs all day long, and they have a melodic quality that is, for my money, has completely disappeared from contemporary music. I mean, and in their day, these are songs that you could really listen to and love, and how things have changed. I mean, not being a big music fan until much later. In fact, I really started to get heavily into music as they broke up, because in '69, I think that was their last year, and then they were done. But just their songs, and I mentioned Penny Lane, Eleanor Rigby, Magical Mystery Tour, I Am the Walrus. They started to do as you pointed out, they started to bring in orchestral stuff, and it became very complex songs, and they were very listenable.
Well, they were great. And they began more or less as a novelty in terms of their music, but got very quickly into some seriously great music that someone like Frank Sinatra could even comment on and truthfully say that one of the great love songs of all time, Something. I worked for United Artists through Hard Day's Night, through Help, and through The Yellow Submarine, which was a terrific movie. And those movies stand up today. Yellow Submarine was kind of strange in terms of the audience's reaction to it. They were like, hey, maybe they would smoke stuff and watch it, and it was a great.
Arthur, in terms of A Hard Day's Night, when they first started marketing, they didn't think they had. I mean, they thought it was a flash in the pan, didn't they? They thought
yes, as I said earlier, I got to work for UA in March of 1964. And all of a sudden, about a month or so later, we heard we're going to do Hard Day's Night. The company's going to do it, but they got to get it out fast because everybody seemed to think they were, in fact, a flash in the pan, that they'd be over by the time the movie came out. So David Picker, who was president of the company at the time, passed on word, let's move this thing through quickly. And I think it got out in August of 64.
Summer of 64, absolutely.
Yeah, and it was a smash. It was smash right out of the box. And it was great.
And it was David who got them to go to United Artists, and the same with the Bond movies. David Picker was the man who was the person negotiating, and he was much younger than anybody there in the top echelon, and he understood a lot that a lot of the older guys didn't. And they let him go. They let him do it. And of course, the Bond movies and the Beatles. I mean, you don't get bigger than that at that point in the '60s.
Julian, David Picker, who did bring the Beatles in and the others that you mentioned, he was like only 33 years old when he really got hot with UA, which was much different than, Irving Thalberg many years earlier with MGM was also a young guy. But when we were involved, you and I, in the business in those days in the 60s, most of those guys were old who were running studios, weren't they?
Ancient.
Yes. Cubby Broccoli told me that he was offered the Beatles franchise, that before it went to Walter Shenson, who obviously was the producer, Cubby, they turned it down. They didn't think it was, they had their hands full with the Bond movies, but they apparently did have an opportunity to produce the Beatles movies, and they turned it down.
Yeah.
It was interesting that the Beatles let it be known that their influences were Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino and Elvis and Everly Brothers and Bob Dylan. All of those guys influenced their music, and they admitted that too. It's interesting too that one of their big numbers they didn't write, which was an Isley Brothers number called Twist and Shout, which is a big song, and they kind of covered it and made it a big hit after the Isley Brothers.
They had hits out of covers as well. On the dark side, I was one of the many millions of people who were watching Monday Night Football in 1970 or whatever it was, 71, and Howard Cosell broke in with the news that John Lennon was killed.
Yeah, that was in 1980.
Was that 1980?
Actually.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
I was tuned into that. And what a shocking thing that was. But there it was again, an assassination in our society. It was awful.
And people forget that George Harrison, even though he died of lung cancer, he was attacked by a guy with a knife, almost killed.
Yeah, 2 years before he died. 2 years before he died. In his home. No less. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty bad. Mike, what about the Beatles with you? You're the youngest of the four. And you're no kid either. But tell us.
No, I'm not a kid.
But tell us.
I grew up with the Beatles. That's the thing. Ever since as far back as I can remember, the Beatles have always been part of my life. And literally from, my parents, when we were driving in the car, we had, cassettes of the Beatles' Red album or Blue album on, which is their greatest hits. And then, growing up to appreciate them, starting to watch the movies, watching their solo careers, and, being, the Beatles are one of the biggest influences probably to me than pretty much most other bands. There's only like one or two musicians or bands that had more. And, I've seen in concert, I've seen the surviving Beatles, solo in concert. I saw George Harrison. I see Ringo at least 2 or 3 times, and I've seen Paul McCartney. So the Beatles are hugely, hugely, influential in my life. And, I was one of the first people in line when the CDs went on sale for the first time, and they brought the music to CD for the first. And it's just, all the different iterations, the Peter Jackson movie that just came out a year and a half ago on Disney, or, being able to watch the old footage and being able to follow and everything. Yeah, I was not born when the Beatles came to America, but I was able to appreciate it afterwards. And I have my parents to thank for that. And, it's interesting how you were like saying how their early influences were artists from the 1950s, but even during the 60s, they had other influences, because they credit a lot of it that the Beach Boys actually were a huge influence on them. And that pushed Paul McCartney to start and George and of course John to start writing Sgt. Pepper, because the Beach Boys came out with an album called Pet Sounds, and the Beatles were like, oh, we have to do something to top this. They'd listen to it because, it was, Pet Sounds was so groundbreaking. The Beatles, Paul McCartney was like, we've got to up our game. That's where they went.
I've always wondered, because I'm a big fan of Pet Sounds, what was so unique about Pet Sounds, Mike, in terms of
the harmonies, the mixing, the use of certain type of instruments, and the use of stereo sound, because that was just starting up at that time, where you had certain sounds coming out of the left speaker and the right speaker and such. And the Beatles flew with that with George Martin. And it was just amazing to see. But then in a lot of ways, the Beatles actually started falling apart when their manager,
Brian
Epstein passed away. And they kind of started losing focus. And that's the result of that was the White Album, because the White Album was the first time they released an album that they didn't collaborate with each other until they got into the studio to record the songs. They each came with their own songs and everything.
Brian Epstein was an interesting character. He was a record store manager in Liverpool, and he went to the famous Cavern Club, where, of course, the Beatles really became famous in Liverpool, and heard them and signed them and left the record store management and started managing them. It's interesting, if you think about it, that their two biggest places before they hit America were Liverpool and Hamburg. And the reason, if you think about that, and you may not, is the fact that they were seaports. And the sailors wanted to hear American rock and roll, and they couldn't get it on the BBC. BBC would play very little, if any, rock and roll at that point. And so the sailors came to these clubs to hear American rock and roll. And it's interesting, they're both seaports as well.
One of the interesting things about the Beatles, too, is they began the so-called British invasion of music, because the Beatles begat the Rolling Stones, the so-called Dave Clark Five, God knows.
The Animals, Herman's
Hermits.
Jerry and the Pacemakers.
Yes, it was an industry. It was an absolute
Hey, how about
industry.
Pet Clark?
Just go downtown, Steve.
Tula Clark. There was also another movie that while I was at United Artists that they had, which no one thought it would do anything. They released it. It's called Let It Be, a little documentary that did business because it was the Beatles, with a great song, by the way.
Well, I was involved in that in an interesting way. I was working for the notorious but a good friend of mine, Alan Klein, who was the manager of both the Beatles and the Rolling Stones at one point. And he owned a piece of Let It Be because he had a piece of the Beatles. They said they opened the movie in England. It got bad reviews. They did not want to open it, but they opened in America, got mixed reviews. They took it out of service. Alan sued the Beatles, and I became, sadly for me, but I was working for the guy as a consultant, I had to go and testify against the Beatles. But the idea was simple. The Beatles' lawyer was claiming that the movie was worthless. Well, a Beatles movie that had a song called Let It Be, their last movie, was so far from worthless that they had no chance in winning that case. None whatsoever. And so it was kind of an interesting experience for me. But Let It Be, while not their greatest movie, certainly, was certainly a playable film.
Playable and profitable.
And profitable. That's what Alan wanted. He wanted his share, and he was one tough character. But fortunately...
It's interesting, too, though, because the recent Peter Jackson documentary was taken from extra footage.
That's
for
right.
Let It
That's
Be.
right.
And it was all digitally restored, and it's all beautiful. But it's, a lot of that had been a lot of the footage that they used had just been sitting in closets since 1970. And it's just amazing.
It is quite something to watch them work together, even though at that point there was an enormous amount of animosity, particularly between Lennon and McCartney, which was kind of sad. And George Harrison, felt very, very left out. He felt not part of it. He was very unhappy. Interesting about George Harrison, Arthur may remember this, he formed a movie company called Handmade Films. And Handmade Films made 23 motion pictures, including Monty Python's The Life of Brian and The Time Bandits. But they did a bunch of movies with Bob Hoskins and Helen Mirren and Michael Caine. I mean, these were not small movies. And but he had a partner named Dennis O'Brien, who ostensibly decided to take some of the money without letting George know. Big lawsuit, and George won. But it's interesting that all of these guys went out and did pretty well individually. Now, that's unusual, too. We look at some of the great, let's say, 3 or 4 people, and I'm not knocking other people, but if, let's say, All in the Family is this giant success, but what happened to little Sally Struthers or something, you know? And I'm not knocking her. She certainly worked. But the idea was all four of these people, all four of them had careers and had success right to today.
Yes, and John Lennon had a whole new life with Yoko Ono, who created this whole new life for him. Paul McCartney goes on to Wings, another huge success. And George Harrison, of course, died young, but he really got into things with the Maharishi and all that.
Bangladesh. He got involved with the concert for Bangladesh.
He did. And then there's a great story that I think I may have mentioned before on one of our earliest shows, where every month the Beatles estates or the Beatles business people or the Beatles themselves would appear at the Plaza Hotel with their agents, managers, representatives, accountants, to go over the various offers that would come in. This was going on right through up till when John Lennon was still alive. And they'd all meet in a ballroom. And imagine, most people say agents don't get you work. Agents just take phone calls. And to some extent, it's true, to some extent. Could you imagine the offers that would come into the Beatles to do advertisements or to sponsor running shoes, whatever? They were by the hundreds every month. And so they would read the offers off to the four Beatles who were present and their advisors, and they say, well, here's one from Canada, and they want you to represent Tim Hortons Donuts. We don't want to do that, and each one would go, well, let me think about it, let me ponder, I'll talk, or whatever. And they'd come to Ringo and he'd say, I'll take it. I'll take whatever they offer us. He was always fast.
He was open. Well, I forgot to say that Imagine, written by John Lennon, is one of my favorite songs of all time.
Mine too.
It's a great, great song. He also wrote Strawberry Fields Forever. And I lived 2 blocks away from Strawberry Fields that Yoko put in Central Park, right at 72nd Street, right off Central Park West.
Well, that's the Imagine emblem, isn't it, Julian? Isn't that the Imagine? It's there. I think it's called Imagine.
It's called Strawberry Fields.
Yeah, but there's no circle.
Imagine is there, of course.
Yeah.
But the idea was that, what?
John and Yoko lived in the Dakota, right?
They did, right across the street.
Have you ever been in the Dakota, Julian?
I have. I was in Leonard Bernstein's apartment. Yeah.
What was it like inside the Dakota? I mean, that apartment building has the greatest reputation.
Well, it's one of the oldest buildings in New York, and the reason it's called the Dakota, it was so far uptown, it was like going to the North or South Dakota at that point. Carly Simon lived in that building. Rex Reed lived in that building. Lauren Bacall lived in that building. I would walk in my neighborhood and I would think, gee, I could package a film here if I could put these people together.
Wasn't John Lennon assassinated in front of the building?
Right in front of it. He lived there. Yeah. And he lived there, sure.
Where were you when that happened, Julian? Where were you?
Arthur, I don't know. I don't remember.
The police are still wondering about that, Julian, so it's okay.
I'm innocent. But
Ira Levin, who wrote Rosemary's Baby, I think said it in the Dakota, although they didn't call it I think they called it the Bramford or something.
But it does take place in the Dakota. You're absolutely right. That's true. There's a whole group of buildings on Central Park West, rather famous: the Majestic, the Dakota, the San Remo, the Beresford, and the El Dorado. And if you looked at who were in those buildings or who are in those buildings, they're the most famous people in show business. From, Bono to Steve Martin to Steve Jobs. When he was alive, lived there. I mean, they all lived in that kind of murderous row, as we called it.
Now, has anybody ever met a Beatle?
I never did.
I did.
Hey.
Oh, well, tell us, Mike.
Come on, Mike.
When I was working in radio years and years ago, I was interning at a radio station in Washington, D.C., and this was 1989, 1990, and I was, interning. I walked into the radio station, And sitting there right on the couch was George Harrison.
Wow.
And he was there to promote, I think, his tour, or he was playing in town that night. And he was there and to be interviewed by the afternoon guy. And I was just like, it's a Beatle. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Mike,
oh my
I
God.
can't imagine. I can't imagine
and,
you're being involved with radio with your voice. My God. Just kidding, Mike.
No, not at all.
I mean, if there's ever a voice built for radio, it's yours.
The traveling Willoughbys. George Harrison is one of the traveling Willoughbys. Now, I want you guys to tell me.
Traveling Wilburys.
I want you guys to name who the other people were.
I can do that really
Go
easy.
ahead, Mike, because I won't even try.
No, it was George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and
You're getting one person.
Billy Joel?
Did I do Jeff
J.L.
Lynne? Jeff Lynne from the Electric Light Orchestra.
Okay,
He produced all of those.
But that's one hell of a group. I mean, Petty, Dylan,
it was an amazing group.
Harrison, my God, incredible.
Mm-hmm. And the sad thing was that Roy Orbison passed away right before the album came out.
Oh, wow.
Did you know what James Bond said about the Beatles? Do you remember? In Goldfinger, he's making, he's just finished making love to Jill Masterson, and he reaches for the champagne, and it's cold, it's warm, so he goes to get another bottle, and Jill says, "Who needs it?" And he says, "My dear girl, you can't drink Dom Perignon 55 below the temperature of such and such. That's like listening to the Beatles without earmuffs."
Well.
Wow.
That gets a big hiss in a movie that gets mostly hoorays, but that was 60 years ago. Yeah, no.
You know what shocked me, guys? I don't know if you're aware of this. I was surprised when I did some research for our show, was that their last concert that they ever did, not counting on the top of their offices, not that, a real concert, was in Candlestick Park in San Francisco. And they didn't sell out. They didn't sell out. They did not sell out.
That brings about the question, though, Julian, have you ever been in Candlestick Park at night? You'd freeze.
You mean,
it is freezing.
It's so cold.
Yes.
And plus the fog. That comes in.
Cold.
But they sold 25,000 tickets out of something like 32.5.
Wow.
So it's impossible. I kept checking this because I kept thinking, no, this can't be true. But the web keeps saying it's true, and the web is wildly inconsistent. So this seemed to be the only thing they said. I'm shocked at that, though. One
of the things that happened with the Beatles when they came on in 1964 in the music business was there were some hugely successful artists, including Frank Sinatra. And all of those guys were making big hit records to that point. And when the Beatles caught on, the sales of all of these other artists went down. I mean, dramatically down for years. And they were, making it in concerts in Vegas and all that kind of stuff. But their record sales were down tremendously.
And
that's how big the Beatles were.
And that was the 1-2 punch, Arthur, because it was Elvis and then the Beatles that knocked Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald and Frankie Lane and Nat King Cole. All these people were really struggling to have hits at that point.
Yes. Speaking of Elvis for 1 second, who the Beatles loved, by the way, of course they did. But who do you believe Elvis got most of his singing voice from? Who do you think he took from? Now it's not the Beatles, by the way. You mentioned it before, Steve. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a lot of this guy.
Well, really?
When you listen to Elvis Presley, you're hearing a lot of Roy Orbison. Intentionally. He loved Roy Orbison.
Well, he certainly also was inspired by rhythm and blues and African-American music, and clearly gospel was all part of his influence.
We're going to be doing a show somewhere in the near future on Elvis. Again, somebody who was great, as were the Beatles. Not just good recording artists, but these guys were great. Leonard Bernstein spoke of the Beatles that these guys are brilliant. You know, their songwriting was fantastic, as well as their performing.
And also, I think we should talk a little bit about style. I mean, when they first came on, like I said, when I first saw them, between their haircuts and their outfits, they didn't look like anybody I'd ever seen before in the States. It was kind of a whole new image, and I think that it influenced. This, of course, is the 60s, the mod era, with all the new style fashions coming out of England. And I think they had an impact on that with their whole approach. I mean, the idea of having long hair was nothing new, but I think that they kind of made it uncool to have short hair.
Well, long hair, it was shocking. It shocked the country at that point. It was long hair, and if you look at it now, it's not that long. But at the time, it was considered absolutely unbelievable. I remember it was considered anti-establishment.
You know,
Yeah, they used to call them girls, and they used to say all this different stuff about the Beatles. Oh, they're a bunch of girls with the long hair and everything. Compared to how the haircuts were 5 years later, they had relatively short hair when they first.
Pre JFK's assassination, and then the oncoming of the Beatles, there was again this thing called the Age of Innocence, when, if you were lucky enough to be with a girl and maybe have some fun with a girl, that girl might be didn't need it. She might be wearing a girdle. She might be wearing stockings with garters, certainly bras, and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes before you'd have fun, it would take 10 minutes to just make it all happen. But post that, when we went from the Age of Innocence to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, that same girl was not wearing almost anything underneath what she was wearing. That was part of it. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. And the world changed in that period of months. And the Beatles were very much, in not bad ways, but responsible for them. Because then along came Vietnam, and everything went completely crazy. If you go from 1959 to 1969, it's unbelievable.
And we have the assassinations on top of JFK of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther
King, right? So the attempt on George Wallace, whatever that's worth, but it was.
And their music changed with the times. I think if you follow that period from say 64 to 70, you see the influences. You know, the story of Lennon going off to, I think Harrison and Lennon went off to India, and that influenced their music, and then. They got into, of course, the drug culture influenced a lot of their work, especially some of their songs. I mean, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, isn't that one of their many drug songs, Mike? I'm not 100% sure on that.
Of course, one of very many.
Many.
And it's pretty awesome. You know, you hear a lot of influences, like you had said, from Eastern cultures. And, you know, George Harrison very much brought the sitar into, you know, popularity, and it's real interesting. You hear some of it. There's literally chanting in some of their songs, and it's just amazing, you know, when you hear, you know, it, and then you watch Yellow Submarine, and man, you see so much in that movie. If you're on your acid or some of the other drugs that were available at the time, like mushrooms and such, and it's just amazing to
Mike, invariably, recording artists become successful on the heels of a breakout hit record. It happens virtually to all of them. They have some kind of record comes along and it explodes whatever they've done before it and everything they've done after it. Bobby Darin is an example. Mac the Knife. It was just one of the great records of all time. Sinatra had several of them. What was the biggest selling Beatle record? Was there something that was bigger than anything else?
I think Hey Jude and I Want to Hold Your Hand were their two biggest sellers, but I'm not sure. But I know that they were very big.
And also, there would probably be an album along those lines too that was bigger than anything else.
Well, the Beatles sold, according to, again, the information, 600 million albums. 600 million albums. I mean, it's unbelievable. And 20,
Well,
go ahead, Mike.
the best-selling album according to Billboard by the Beatles is "I Want to Hold Your Hand," is their top song. And
How many copies does it say?
It says, hold on, 12 million copies sold worldwide.
Singles, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
No,
And it was released in 1963 and became the band's first number one song in the United States and their first hit on the Billboard Top 100 on February 1st, 1964, debuting at number 45.
That's February 64 is when they appeared on Ed Sullivan.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that was a pretty good beginning. They had 20 number one hits, I guess, 20 number one songs, 34 in the top 10. I mean, their record is extraordinary. Of course, maybe little Taylor Swift will beat them soon, but up until then, I think they're probably right up in the number one position of selling the most or close.
Yes, and they were of this time, this certain time in our history that kind of goes hand in hand. You know,
according to this chart, "She Loves You" actually beat out "I Want to Hold Your Hand" in August '63. This was back when they were still in England.
Can't be 63. Impossible.
It says August '63.
It's wrong.
Well, why is it wrong?
Because they didn't get to the United States till January, February.
Well, no, this is probably the best-selling Beatles song in England before they.
In England, yeah. Well, that's different.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking worldwide.
I mean, the top five are "She Loves You," "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "Can't Buy Me Love," "I Feel Fine," and "Day Tripper."
But that's
all early stuff,
England.
Which is real interesting.
That's England, Steve.
Yeah.
We're talking worldwide. You got to get off the island, man.
Yeah. Their best-selling album is Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah.
And that sold 32 million copies.
And that has some cover.
And that was released in 1967.
That's one of the most interesting album covers I've ever seen.
Yes.
It was a purely counterculture.
It was the one sheet of the movie too, Julian.
Yeah.
So did you guys see
Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? They were great.
Did you guys see the movie yesterday?
Oh, I loved that movie. It was.
I did too. Liked it.
Mm-hmm. It was so very well done.
Julian, you got to catch up with this one. This is a movie where a young African, I guess he's a black musician.
He's actually Indian.
Thank you. He's Indian.
Sorry.
He wakes up. There's a huge power outage around the world. Everything goes out for a split second. And when everything comes back to normal, he's one of the only people who's ever heard of the Beatles. Nobody has ever heard of the Beatles. And it's kind of a Twilight Zone type moment. There are other things that nobody's ever heard of cigarettes. So
that may be a good thing.
He's in an alternative universe where nobody has heard of the Beatles. So he starts to remember the songs and writing the words down, and he starts to record them. And you can imagine what happens, or you can't imagine what happens. It's a fanciful, really wonderful movie.
The genre is the time warp genre.
The time warp genre.
It goes to a time warp. A really nice movie. Well done.
It's actually more a parallel universe situation because he doesn't actually go back in time, but the contemporary world is changed. And there's this very, very emotional moment where he meets John Lennon, who's basically unknown. It's worth watching.
Okay, I've written it down.
Yesterday.
Yeah. I actually choked up when he met John because it was such a great scene.
No, exactly.
Lennon was very much a peace and love. His song "Imagine" is one of the great classic songs of our time, and says a lot about everything to this day.
Wasn't the group the Monkees immediately?
Yes.
They came on like gangbusters in America as an American version of the Beatles and became an overnight sensation.
Well, a couple of guys like Bert Schneider and Donnie Kirshner did the Beatles. They just called them the Monkees. And they basically did Hard Day's Night on television.
They even looked a little bit like them, some of the haircuts.
Did you guys like Hard Day's Night?
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was great.
Fun.
Because, again, as we've all pointed out, it was their sense of humor, their fun, their feeling of fun. And Richard Lester, way before MTV, knew how to start cutting quickly. That was not done in movies, what they did in Hard Day's Night. You were flying all over the place
Right.
there, and that was quite something. Of course, MTV came on after, and they kind of copied that quick kind of cutting. But that was, yes, it was. And I believe it was in black and white, too, no less.
I remember seeing it in the
Yes,
screening
it
room
was.
in Boston in 1964 before it came out. And a lot of the older exhibitors, God bless them, were sitting there going, what's happening? It's going too fast. Why are they doing this? You know, it's too fast. My eyes are going bad. And of course, you know, I thought to myself, this is a hit. And it was a hit. Was it ever?
It was funny, Arthur, because we both were very young in a business that were very old.
Yes.
And so often we were called upon to give the young person's opinion as if we really knew.
Julian,
But we
I can't
certainly
tell
knew
you
more
this.
than they did. We knew
Right.
that.
I can't tell you the screenings that I would go to in those days when 1 minute into the movie, whatever it was, you hear snoring and they were sleeping. And the movie would end, they go, that was great. That was a great movie. I'll buy it. I'll take it.
I remember going to see Cabaret at the North Point Theater in San Francisco, the sneak preview before it opened, and they said, well, you can't do a musical about the Nazis.
There you go.
It was great because I launched that movie at the Ziegfeld Theater, and boy, it changed the whole theater, that theater for me.
There's a thing on YouTube about Kander and Ebb, Julian, having to do with the show you did with
John Kander.
John Kander. There's about a 58-minute piece of them doing a little concert on piano and singing. I don't know. You ever see that?
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
Fred Ebb sweats up a storm on that.
Yes. I'll be watching. I'll be listening for your show. That's for sure.
Oh, thank you.
John Kander. God almighty. Kander.
97, guys. 97 years old. And still, he's doing a movie, Kiss of the Spider Woman, written and directed by Bill Condon and starring, who do you think the Spider Woman is? J-Lo. That's right. So there you go.
Jennifer Lopez.
And I think it's Sam Mendes, the director, who's very, very much remembered for having done a couple of Bond movies, also did American Beauty. He's announced, I believe, that they're going to make 4 movies about the Beatles. It's going to be from the story of the Beatles from each of them's point of view. So you're going to get a Ringo movie, you're going to get a John movie, a George movie, and a Paul movie. And these are going to be major features. I believe Sony is behind them.
Well,
Yes.
Sony owns their music, so they might as well be behind it.
And as Julian and I know one thing, and that is that those number 2, 3, and 4 are subject to what happens with number 1 in terms of box office, whether it will come
Good
or
point.
not. I would like to recommend to all of the people, nice people who listen to our show, that perhaps they play John Lennon's song "Imagine" and listen closely to the lyrics that this guy wrote. It would be worth it. It would be worth it. So
It's interesting, too, because Imagine is one of the most boycotted songs out
why?
there by religious organizations because of the lyrics.
Why? Really? I didn't know that, Mike.
Yeah. Yep. You will not hear on a lot of radio stations anymore. You will not hear Imagine.
I would think religious groups
Because-
would love the song.
No, why? He says, "Imagine there's no heaven."
Well, that's not, but
You know.
but the essence of the whole song is
You know.
peace, love, and all of the things. Yes.
I know, but because of lines like that, imagine there's no religion, imagine everything's in peace. It's a wonderful song. It's a beautiful song, but some religious organizations came out against
I guess
it,
that happens, and we don't want to get into stuff like that.
and they boycotted radio stations who played
Yes.
it,
So
and
that's enough.
it's just craziness.
That's truly enough to ruin my weekend. So, based on that,
Yeah, imagine all those people
yeah,
living life as easy,
You know,
living life in peace. Whoa!
Speaking of Beatles songs that are influenced by rock and roll, one of my favorites was "Back in the USSR," which I thought was really a fun little riff on those wacky Russians.
I was trying to find out how many songs the Beatles actually wrote. Of course, I went on the web. One said 208, another one said 213. So all we know is they wrote a lot of songs, and they sold a lot of albums.
And had a lot of hits. Yeah, I bet you, Julian, the percentage of hits to songs written is colossal.
Well,
Oh, very much so. Here's a little bit of Beatles news before we get out of here and everything. July 7th, 2024 is a very big day coming up. After 18 years, the Beatles' Love will be closing at the Mirage in Las Vegas. It's been playing every day
For 18
years.
And that's a live show, right?
That's one of their live performances, and it uses Beatles music, and it was all, it was the Beatles, the surviving members 18 years ago were all there for the opening. And of course, like Yoko Ono was there, and even, George Harrison was still
Yoko
around.
is now
So
over 90?
It was just, yes, I'm pretty sure she is, but it's such an amazing show. I've seen it 3 times, and it's a beautiful, beautiful show. If you ever get a chance to go to Vegas and see this, it's stunning. The visuals, the colors, the music. George Martin actually remixed all the music for the show for them and everything. It was
Just an non sequitur
awesome.
to Julian. How long did the Fantastics play off Broadway, Julian?
oh my God, Arthur! It was, I think, over 30 years. It really was a long time.
Try to remember, Julian. Try to remember.
Oh, it's a wonderful song. The kindest, who was introduced on that? Jerry Orbach.
Yes.
Who people don't realize had a gorgeous singing voice.
Really?
Baritone. Yeah. He was the original star on Broadway of Carnival. And as Arthur said, he was in the Fantastics, and he was also in the Brecht Threepenny Opera. So he had quite a history before, I guess, Law and Order.
And I saw him in Promises, Promises in Boston before it went to Broadway.
Oh.
And he was great. So was the show.
Yeah.
Beatles, bring back everything. Yeah, bring back.
And he's Jennifer Grey's father in Dirty Dancing, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
he was also in Beauty and the Beast. He was one of the voices in the animated movie. He sang in it.
And I think he was a hood in a Woody Allen movie, Martin Landau's brother, who has to get rid of Angela Houston.
Barbara and I saw Irving Berlin's 100th birthday celebration at Carnegie Hall. And Jerry Orbach was one of the opening acts on Broadway singing A Pretty Girl Is Like a Melody. Jerry Orbach was a song and dance man who became a star of, drama.
Julian, who's your guest on your show this upcoming week?
We're with Eddie Izzard, part 2. And then Martin Sheen comes in the week after. But like the song Strawberry Fields Forever, I think we can say the Beatles' music is forever. And that's kind of nice.
Completely.
Yes.
To all of our wonderful listeners who enjoy our show, thank you, as always, for being supportive. Please write to us and tell us what you think of our show. We love hearing from our fans. And if you would like to write to us, even with suggestions about guests or topics, please write to talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. That's an easy one to remember. And we're on all the platforms. We have our own YouTube channel. We have presence on social media, and we love hearing from you guys.
And Steve, who's on your podcast this week?
I'm glad. Good. Thanks for doing that.
I have a wonderful agent.
Wonderful. It must be Robert Wagner. No.
He's an agent turned producer named Alan Gasmer, former senior vice president with the William Morris Agency.
Alan, yeah.
And he's now producing. He was one of the lead producers on the Vikings television series. I get a forensic look on his career, how he became an agent. It's a great kind of how to join agencies and how he made it is very interesting. That's my guest.
Great. We'll look forward to yours and to Julian's. And Julian, when is the John Kander? When is the John Kander episode up?
Probably sometime the end of May.
Look forward to that.
Let you guys know. But I want to thank Mike for jumping in and helping us on the Beatles. I think he knows more than the three of us put together on that one.
It's a passion of mine. What can I say?
Mike Faber is one of the anchors of our show. He's our producer. Always a pleasure to see you, Mike.
You are the voice, Mike, the golden voice.
Thank you, my friends. Until next time, folks, this has been Tales from Hollywoodland.
Bye, everybody.
Take us out.
Bye-bye.
In the Cosmic Pizza Podcast, your pizza delivery guys,
Paul, Dan, Sean,
Casey,
serve you a slice of life. We talk to women in comedy, voice actors, directors, producers, and authors.
We also talk about conspiracy theories, our top 3 films of the decade, famous people we confuse with each other, and our favourite stand-up comedians.
We've recast Star Trek and Babylon 5 and created alternate superheroes.
But most of all, we have had so much fun doing it every 2 weeks.
2 weeks! Cosmic Pizza Podcast is not about the cosmos or pizza.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.